June in the United States feels like a real shift in the garden. The cool edges of spring are gone, and the soil finally stays warm through the day and into the night. You can almost feel it the moment you step outside in the morning. The air is heavier, the light is sharper, and everything seems ready to move. If you've been holding off on planting, waiting for things to feel right, this is usually the moment when it finally does. June is that point where the garden stops hesitating. But what's interesting is, this month isn't really about starting everything from scratch. It's more about making smarter choices with what you put in the ground. Some plants will take off almost immediately in this heat, like they've been waiting for it. Others, no matter how much care you give them, just won't respond the same way. So the real question becomes pretty simple. What actually works right now, when summer is just starting to stretch out and settle in? Let's take a slow walk through it, like we're standing in a backyard, figuring it out together. If there's one thing that really defines a June garden in the United States, it's the warm season vegetables. This is the group that doesn't just handle summer heat, they actually seem to come alive because of it. Tomatoes are usually the first thing people think about. Once those night temperatures stay steady and warm, you can almost see the difference week by week. They stop hesitating and just take off, stretching upward like they've been waiting for this exact stretch of weather all year. Cucumbers aren't far behind. They grow in a completely different way fast, spreading, almost taking over whatever space you give them. And once they get comfortable, it often feels like you're harvesting more than you expected, almost faster than you can keep up. Then, summer really starts to show its personality with squash and zucchini. These plants don't really slow down once they start. One healthy plant can turn into a constant flow of harvests if the conditions are right. It's the kind of growth that surprises even people who've grown them before. Peppers move a little differently. They're not in a rush. At first, it almost feels like nothing is happening. But quietly, they're settling in, building strength, adjusting to the heat. And later in the season, they repay that patience with steady, heavy production. And then there are beans. Simple, reliable, almost satisfying to watch. Give them a bit of support, a bit of water, and they just climb. They respond quickly, like they're always ready for the next bit of sunlight. At some point, you start noticing a pattern. The garden in June doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels active, almost energetic in a different way. Some plants seem to thrive without effort, while others struggle even with care. Have you ever noticed that in your own space, how certain crops just seem to prefer the heat, almost like they belong to summer itself? Leafy greens are a different kind of challenge in June. In a lot of parts of the United States, this is where things start to get a little tricky for them. What worked perfectly in spring doesn't always hold up once the heat really settles in. Spinach and regular lettuce are usually the first to show it. At the beginning, they look fine, but as soon as temperatures climb, they can shift fast. Instead of staying soft and leafy, they rush into flowering. Gardeners call it bolting, and once it starts, there's really no going back. That's usually the moment people start thinking greens just aren't worth it in summer. But that's not really the full story. There are other options that handle the heat much better. New Zealand spinach, for example, doesn't behave like traditional spinach at all, but it gives you a similar feel on the plate. Amaranth is another one that surprises people. It's tougher, more adaptable, and still gives you something fresh to work with, even in hot weather. Some gardeners also keep experimenting with kale, especially the varieties that can tolerate warmer conditions. A bit of afternoon shade can make a noticeable difference too, like giving the plant a small break from the sun before it pushes through the rest of the day. And after a while, you start to see the pattern. It's not really about forcing the same plants to work in every season. It's more about paying attention to what the season is actually asking for. That small shift changes how you look at the whole garden, because suddenly, you're not fighting the heat anymore. You're working with it. There's another group of summer plants that doesn't always get much attention, but in June heat, they quietly outperform expectations. Okra is a perfect example. In hot, humid parts of the United States, especially in the South, it almost feels like it belongs there. Once it gets established, it doesn't ask for much. It just keeps producing, steady and reliable, even when the weather gets intense. Then you have cowpeas, sometimes called southern peas. These are the kind of plants that don't need perfect soil or constant attention. They handle tough conditions surprisingly well and still manage to give you a solid harvest. There's something reassuring about that kind of resilience in a garden. Green beans fit into this same category too. They're not flashy, but they're dependable. Give them a simple trellis, some regular watering, and they'll keep climbing and producing over and over again through the season. What's interesting is that these plants rarely get the spotlight. People tend to focus on tomatoes or peppers, But these quieter growers often end up being the most consistent part of the harvest. And in a way, they become the backbone of a summer garden. Not the ones you talk about the most, but the ones you can actually rely on when the heat really settles in. Not everything in a June garden is about food. At some point, the space starts to shift, and color becomes just as important as anything you're harvesting. Sunflowers are usually the first thing people notice. They don't just grow in the background, they change the feeling of the whole yard. Tall, open, always turning with the sun, they bring a kind of quiet movement that you end up noticing more than you expect. Marigolds are a different kind of presence. Bright, simple, and practical at the same time. A lot of gardeners plant them not just for color, but because they seem to help keep certain pests away naturally. It's one of those small things that makes gardening feel a bit more balanced. Then you start seeing zinnias, cosmos, and petunias filling in the space. They don't demand much attention, but they keep blooming steadily through the heat of summer. There's something easy about them, no complicated care. Just steady color that lasts. And after a while, the garden starts to feel incomplete without them. It's almost strange how much difference a few flowers can make, even in a space full of vegetables and herbs. Have you ever walked past a garden and felt your attention stop for a second just because of a few bright blooms in the middle of everything else? Herbs are often the easiest win in a June garden, especially if you're just getting started. They don't take up much space, they grow fast in warm soil, and you start noticing the difference in everyday life much sooner than you expect. Basil is usually the one that surprises people first. Give it a bit of sun and warmth, and it just takes off. A few fresh leaves can completely change a meal. Suddenly, even something simple starts to taste like summer. Mint behaves in the opposite way. It spreads quickly, sometimes more than you want it to, but that same energy makes it incredibly easy to grow. Even if you forget about it for a while, it still finds a way to come back strong. Then there's rosemary and thyme. They don't rush. They grow slowly, steadily, almost quietly in the background. But once they settle in, they feel like they're always going to be there, year after year, without much effort. Oregano fits in easily too, and cilantro is a bit more unpredictable in the heat. Some days it does well, other times it bolts before you really get to use it. What's interesting about herbs is how close they feel to daily life. You don't just grow them, you smell them when you walk by. You use them while cooking. You notice them in small moments throughout the day without really thinking about it. June gardening in the United States doesn't look the same everywhere, and that's something you really start to notice once you pay attention. The calendar says it's the same month, but the experience can feel completely different depending on where you are. In the northern regions, June often feels like the real beginning. The soil is finally warm enough, and gardeners are just getting into the main planting season. A lot of warm crops are still going into the ground for the first time, almost like the season is just opening up. Move into the Midwest, and things shift quickly. The heat builds faster, and timing starts to matter more. If cucumbers, beans, or squash are going to do well, they usually need to be in early enough to take advantage of that growing window before the peak heat arrives. Down in the southern states, June already feels like full summer. The garden here is built around heat from the start. Okra, peppers, and cowpeas tend to dominate, not because they're trendy, but because they simply handle those conditions better than most plants. And out west, especially in the drier regions, the focus changes again. It's not just about what you plant, but how you manage water. Drought-tolerant herbs and vegetables often become the practical choice just to keep things going through the heat. So even though it's all called June, it doesn't really feel like one single experience. It depends entirely on where you're standing when you step outside and look at your garden. When you step back and look at everything, June gardening isn't really just about putting plants in the ground. It becomes more about timing, paying attention, and learning a kind of patience that only comes from experience. Some seasons go smoothly from the start, others don't. And sometimes it's surprising the plants you expected to do well struggle, while the ones you barely paid attention to suddenly take over the whole space. That's part of what makes early summer so interesting. It never really follows a perfect plan. You can prepare all you want, but the garden still has its own way of responding. Have you ever planted something and been surprised by how it turned out a few weeks later? Or walked outside and realized the whole feeling of your space changed just because a few things started growing well? In the end, a garden starts to feel less like something you control and more like something you slowly learn from over time, season after season.